We're beginning Chapter 9 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobsen. The Special Group. During the last year of the Eisenhower presidency, and a radical escalation of hidden hand operations, a small group of the presidential's principal advisors began openly discussing among themselves plans to assassinate foreign leaders. This new group was called the Special Group. It was not uncommon for the President's Covert Action Advisory Board to change names. The National Security Council remained the official oversight board, and smaller ancillary groups were often created to deal with the most incendiary and potentially scandalous covert operations. First, there was the Psychological Strategy Board, formed in 1951, as we have seen, during the Guatemala coup d'etat in 1953. The PSB was reorganized as the Operations Coordinating Board, OCB. After the issuance of a new directive, Covert Operations, National Security Council 5412-2 in 1955, the Planning Coordination Group, PCG, was created. Some months later, the Special Group emerged, with requirement for membership of a rank of Assistant Secretary or above. The word assassination was never used and certainly not committed to paper. Instead, a Senate investigation later found the President's advisors used secrecy, compartmentation, circumlocution, and the avoidance of clear responsibility to maintain plausible deniability around assassination schemes. The President's inner circle discussed the pros and cons of eliminating or neutralizing certain individuals and getting rid of or disposing of foreign leaders so as to advance U.S. foreign policy goals. Speaking in riddles to others became commonplace. Senate investigators found, on February 25, 1960, members of the Special Group convened to discuss eliminating General Qasem, the Prime Minister of Iraq, the man who had ordered the machine gun killing of the King of Iraq, his family, and his Prime Minister in 1958, and whom Saddam Hussein had tried to kill the following year. A stenographer took notes as the Special Group discussed setting up a health alteration committee to poison Qasem. We do not consciously seek subjects' permanent removal from the scene. We also do not object to this common complication development, said the CIA's Near East Division Chief. After deliberation, the Special Group agreed that the Prime Minister should be mailed a monogrammed handkerchief laced with poison. For this, the CIA's new Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Bissell, brought the agency's top poison expert, Sidney Gottlieb, on board. The plan never materialized because Prime Minister Qasem's internal enemies killed him first. He suffered a terminal illness before a firing squad in Baghdad, and even when we had nothing to do with, a Special Group memo sarcastically clarified. Other assassination plans discussed by the Special Group in 1960 involved Patrice Lumumba, Prime Minister of Congo. We agree that planning for the Congo would not necessarily rule out consideration of any particular kind of activity which might contribute to getting rid of Lumumba, members agreed on August 25, 1960. A prime example of Special Group circumlocution killing Rafael Trujillo, president of the Dominican Republic, was also discussed. But the most intense focus during Eisenhower's last year as president was on eliminating Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Raul Castro. Raul. In less than a year, these three revolutionaries had emerged from virtual anonymity to establish a Soviet foothold on the island nation of Cuba, located just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Unless Fidel and Raul Castro and Che Guevara could be eliminated in one package, J.C. King warned the special group on March 9, 1960, the situation in Cuba would likely be a long, drawn-out affair. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, agreed. Any plans for the removal of Cuban leaders should be a package deal, since many of the leaders around Castro are even worse than Castro. In March, the special group reached unanimity. Fidel and Raul Castro and Che Guevara should disappear simultaneously. In the 6 years that passed since Che Guevara witnessed the CIA-directed bombing of Guatemala City, he'd become a hardcore guerrilla fighter and an enterprising revolutionary. After leaving Mexico and secretly arriving in Cuba in 1956, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and a band of guerrilla fighters set up a training camp in the Sierra Maestra and began preparing for revolution. Their rebel army numbered between 12 and 200 men at any given time. And with so few fighters in their ranks, loyalty was everything. This world was black and white. You were friend or enemy. If you were enemy, you were targeted and killed. Desertion, insubordination, and defeatism, wrote Che, were punishable by death. When a rebel fighter named Sergio Acuna was caught trying to run away, he was tortured, shot, and hanged. In his journal, Che called the incident sad but instructive. When Che learned that a guide named Etumio Ureta had sold information about their group to the Bastera regime, he executed him on the spot. The situation was uncomfortable for the people and for Etumio, so I ended the problem by giving him a shot with a .32 pistol in the right side of the brain, Che wrote in his diary. After 2.5 years of training in the mountains, on January 1st, 1959, the rebel fighters began making their move on the capital city. Che Guevara led a column of guerrilla fighters out of the mountains and into Havana, while Fidel Castro and a separate column of revolutionaries marched on the south. By the end of the day, in an astonishing display of giving up without a fight, President Bastista's 40,000-man Cuban army laid down their arms en masse. Batista fled to the Dominican Republic, allowing the revolutionaries to assume control. The tyranny had been overthrown, Castro declared. The people won the war. Fidel Castro was the leader of Cuba now. Within weeks of taking power, he began executing people perceived to be leftovers from the Batista regime. He named Che Guevara commander of Havana La Cabañas prison, where war crime tribunals were hastily set up. Those pronounced guilty were lined up against the prison wall and executed by firing squad. In the days that followed the revolution, more than 150 pro-Batista Cubans were shot dead. When asked by the foreign press about the summary executions, Che fired back. To send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary. Besides, he said, the concept of justice was a hypocritical creation of Western capitalists. These procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail, Che insisted. This is a revolution. A revolutionary must become a cold-killing machine, motivated by pure hate. Damn. The executions were about revenge as much as they were about redress, said Raul Castro. In an interview with the Associated Press, he called the men being executed Batista's assassins and cited their responsibility for what he said were 6,000 Batista-era assassinations in Oriente province alone. Cuba was not experiencing a peaceful transfer of power. There was no swearing-in ceremony. Power was being conveyed through bullets, not ballots. As it was in Vietnam, the CIA was deeply troubled by the majority support these radical revolutionaries garnered from the public. At a rally in Havana on January 21st, 1959, Fidel Castro asked an estimated 500,000-person crowd if they supported his policy of execution by firing squad. I'm going to ask the people something, Castro announced from his podium. Those who agree with the justice that is being carried out, those who agree that Batista henchmen should be shot, raise your hands. A sea of hands went up, followed by 2 minutes of applause. Batista is our Hitler, Castro exclaimed, drawing a comparison between the Nuremberg trials and the execution overseen by Che. The Allied powers punished the war criminals after the Second World War, and they have less right to do so than we have, because they meted out punishment under the ex post facto legislation, while we are punishing the war criminals under legislation passed before the crime. In public trials, in court made up of honest men. Castro's background as a lawyer was not lost on the CIA. In no time, Fidel Castro began severing ties with American businesses, oil consortiums among them, ending 50 years of bilateral trade. He delivered firebrand anti-American speeches, rallying against capitalism and the West. When he signed a deal with the Soviet Union to buy their oil in return for military and economic aid, the Sovietization of Cuba officially began. Che started learning Russian and hosting Marxist study groups. He wrote and published a book, Guerrilla Warfare, is titled in homage to Chairman Mao's on guerrilla warfare. Santa Claus was outlawed in Cuba. English no longer allowed. The Chaplin Cinema in downtown Havana was renamed the Carlos Marx. In Washington, D.C., the Eisenhower White House shuddered to think of all that could go wrong. Castro's Cuba raised the specter of a Soviet outpost at America's doorstep, a Senate report read. The State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the oldest civilian intelligence element in the U.S. government and a direct descendant of the Office of Strategic Services Research Department, sent its Director of American Republics, a man identified in declassified documents as Mr. Hall, to Cuba to assess the situation. What Mr. Hall discovered and reported back to the State Department laid the seeds for a series of Title 50 hidden hand operations. including assassination in Cuba over the next 4 years. The hypnotic hold Fidel has over mob fight. Damn. Backing up. The hypnotic hold Fidel has over the mob is frightening, Hall reported. He can raise it to a bloodthirsty pitch, then cool it in an obedient adore. Hitler was never as good, although it must be admitted he worked on a better educated element. Hall wrote on November 18, 1959, Fidel gave one impression of a complete hysteric with a messianic complex, if not a manic depressive, he observed. But Mr. Hall expressed an even greater sense of foreboding when speaking of Che. Che Guevara did not rave nor rant, spoke in the tone of a man who knows what he wants and how to get it, and, as the best educated of the lot, is a truly sinister character. All gave us the devil. What to do, in Mr. Hall's assessment? Fidel, hold on the lower class and on at least half of the middle class is complete. There is an atmosphere of terror prevalent, and for all purposes, a police state exists in Cuba. People are not only afraid to speak before strangers, but persons disappear, as in the time of Batista. To Mr. Hall's eye, the devil we knew, General Batista, was gone, and the new devils, Che and Fidel, were far more menacing than previously realized. Which is when the special group began actively discussing the pros and cons of assassinating Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Raul Castro at a meeting on January 23, 1960. The following month, the State Department approved of a $4.4 million budget to get rid of the three. Possible removal of top three leaders is receiving serious consideration at HQs, according to declassified minutes of the meeting. A follow-up memo discussed arranging an accident, but the State Department's Mr. Hall warned against such action. The assassination of Fidel would bring about looting and a bloodbath such as Havana? It says sick. That's usually a mistake. Probably Havana. Has never known, cautioned Hall. Over the next 4 months, various means of assassination were considered. Then in July 1960, Allen Dulles vetoed the idea. Dulles favored a covert action to invade Cuba with an exile army and force a coup d'etat style after what the CIA had done in Guatemala. This was meant to be a hidden hand operation. Instead, it would become known to the world as the most inglorious CIA debacle of all time. The failed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The invading paramilitary force would be drawn from anti-Castro refugees living in Miami. After Fidel Castro and Che Guevara took power in 1959, some 100,000 Cuban refugees fled the country, a great majority of them landing in Miami. The U.S. government set up resettlement programs, offering housing and jobs to this new diaspora. The CIA began setting up its hidden hand operations for Cuba inside a nondescript building on the University of Miami campus, codenamed Building 25. For a period of time in the 1960s, The CIA's Miami station was the largest CIA intelligence operation facility in the world. Case officers assigned to JM/Wave began keeping track of Cuban emigres, creating profiles and databases, and ultimately figuring out who best to approach for its forthcoming covert action. In the summer of 1960, the CIA began recruiting assets from a pool of young, anti-Castro dissidents of fighting age to make up a paramilitary force codenamed Brigade 2506. What started out as 28 men in a South Florida jungle training camp would eventually grow to more than 1,400 paramilitary operators, spies, saboteurs, and pilots trained by the CIA and U.S. Army Green Berets. One among them was a 19-year-old architecture student named Felix Rodriguez. Well-educated, determined, and nationalistic, Felix Rodriguez was born into a ruling class family in Santisi Spiritus in central Cuba. In 1942, when he was 12, Rodriguez's wealthy uncle Toto, who served as President Batista's Minister of Public Works, paid for him to attend an American boarding school in Pennsylvania. When the revolution happened in 1959, Felix Rodriguez and his family were vacationing in Mexico. There they received word that the Castro regime had seized their properties and turned them over to the state. The family never returned to Cuba, instead moving to Miami. Yeah. Exiled from his homeland, the young Felix Rodriguez became fiercely anti-Castro. His parents begged him to accept what was, he says, to move and to embrace their new situation. They bought him an Aston Martin convertible and enrolled him in the University of Miami. But Felix Rodriguez wanted none of it. I was more interested in joining an anti-Castro organization than I was in continuing my education, he explains. In the fall of 1960, while preparing to begin freshman classes at the university, he was approached by a clandestine service case officer with the CIA. I knew the mission was to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro, Rodriguez explained in 2017. But I had no idea I was being recruited by the CIA. In those days, he guesses, not 1 in 1,000 Cubans had ever heard of the Central Intelligence Agency. Rodriguez believed the cover story he and other recruits were told, that the man playing for the paramilitary action was a wealthy sugar mill baron whose property in Cuba had also been confiscated by the Castro regime. Very believable story. Felix Rodriguez was thrilled to be chosen for a commando operation against the Castro regime. In September 1960, he learned the mission was a go. We were told we were going to a secret location, not in the U.S., Rodriguez recalled. He and a group of young Cuban exiles driven to an airport in Opa-locka, Florida, the same airport the CIA used for its Guatemala coup d'etat. Our clothes and personal possessions were taken. We were strip searched to make sure we weren't carrying any forbidden articles like a compass. Our watches confiscated so we wouldn't know how long we flew. The truck drove into a closed hangar where the men disembarked, only to be greeted by U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Services, INS, officials who gave each of them a form to fill out. It dawned on Rodriguez that if we were leaving the country, we were apparently doing with the approval of the U.S. government. dressed in army fatigues and a khaki shirt. The rebel fighters were loaded onto a C-54 aircraft, its windows painted black, then flown for several hours, landing just before dawn. After we landed, a Jeep drove up, and I noticed immediately that it had Guatemalan plates. The CIA paramilitary army was in Guatemala City as guests of President Roberto Alejo Arzu, a friend of the CIA. The CIA's anti-Castro covert action training camp was located 80 miles northwest of Guatemala City, in the countryside of Ritalhulu, codenamed Camp Tracks. At this abandoned coffee plantation, owned by a business associate of President Arzu, U.S. Army Green Berets trained the Cuban emigres in guerrilla warfare techniques including pistol shooting, map reading, and hand-to-hand combat, but also more ambitious tactics like how to land an amphibious craft on a rocky beach, and how to use explosives powerful enough to take out a bridge. Conditions were grim, Rodriguez recalled. It was human beyond measure. Poisonous insects and alligators were a constant threat. But morale was high thanks to the camp's enthusiastic commanding officer, Colonel Napoleon Valeriano. Colonel Valeriano was an unconventional warfare legend among commandos in training. As a young army soldier in World War II, Valeriano had been infiltrated into the Philippines by submarine. There, he led guerrilla warfare operations against the Japanese alongside Colonel Volkmann, one of the original founders of the U.S. Army Special Forces. With General Robert McClure and Colonel Aaron Bank, Valeriano's staff of trainers at Camp Tracks were Ukrainian-born Green Berets, beneficiaries of the Lodge Philbin Act, called Lodge Billers, many of whom trained with the 10th Special Forces at Bad Tolls. These Green Berets taught the Cuban exile army how to shoot Thompson machine guns, 57mm recoilless rifles, and .45 caliber pistols, remembers Rodriguez, an 18-year-old novice at the time. They gave us instructions in explosives, communications, jungle survival, and escape and invasion techniques. We learned how to judge the distance of an enemy from the sound and muzzle flash. For months into the training, the group was flown at the Panama Canal Zone to the U.S. base, Fort Clayton, for a New Year's Eve party. Our instructors provided Heineken beer and wine so we could celebrate. Shortly before midnight, Rodriguez remembers being struck with a truly inspired idea, he explains. An operation that would shorten the war and save lives. He volunteered to assassinate Fidel Castro, and the CIA took me up on the idea, he says. 1 week later, Rodriguez was flown to Miami, where he was taken to a safe house in the Homestead area outside the city. I was given a rifle and was told to wait. He'd been infiltrated into Cuba by boat, his handlers told him, then taken to Havana, where local partisans working with the CIA would assist him. In Havana, he would go to the upper floor of a predetermined building, set up his high-powered rifle in an open window, and assassinate Fidel Castro as Castro rode by during a parade on the streets below. While the CIA was training Brigade 2506 for paramilitary invasion of Cuba, the special group approved another covert action operation inside Cuba's Caribbean island neighbor, the Dominican Republic, 500 miles to the east. The plan was to assassinate the nation's corrupt, unelected leader, General Rafael Trujillo. For 3 decades, Trujillo, kept in power by American allies, had ruled the country by terror. Trujillo was power-mad and masochistic. Historians hold him responsible for tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings, those in 1937 in broader region with Haiti, which would come to be known as the Parsley Massacre. Few bullets were used, and according to UN Secretary Council report on the mass killing. Instead, 20 to 30,000 Haitians were bludgeoned and bayoneted, then herded into the sea, where sharks finished what Trujillo had begun. For reasons that remain murky, suddenly in winter of 1960, President Eisenhower's special group decided the United States would end its support of Trujillo. Ambassador Joseph Farland remembers appealing to Trujillo's daughter, Flor, during a visit to her home outside the nation's capital. I drove out to her house in a Volkswagen that I had and said, "Your father is going to be assassinated. There is no question in my mind whatsoever about that. We want him to retire and leave this country." When Trujillo refused an offer of exile, the special group agreed it was time to eliminate him. He kept law and order, and he didn't bother the United States, so that was fine with us, said the State Department, Henry Dearborn. And in 1991 oral history interview, Dearborn served as charge d'affaires at the embassy in Santo Domingo, which had been renamed Culiacán Trujillo, or Trujillo City. Something had to be done about this man, Dearborn recalled. On March 16, 1961, matters took an active turn. According to a CIA document marked top secret later reviewed by a Senate Intelligence Committee, they, the CIA, developed an assassination plot which, because of my close relationship with them, I was fully aware of, Dearborn testified. Dearborn served as liaison between the CIA and the assassination team, which was made up of 7 anti-Trujillo partisans. I carried out the contacts with the opposition reporting to CIA, Dearborn clarified, which were using all these weird means of communication because we didn't want to be seen with each other. Things like notes in the bottom of the grocery bag rolled up in cigars. Richard Bissell, then working as CIA station chief in Santo Domingo, oversaw plans on the ground. On March 22nd, he requested that headquarters send him 3 .38 caliber revolvers and ammunition. In a separate cable, Dearborn wrote, plans for Trujillo's assassination coming to a head. The following week, Bissell briefed Dearborn. A shipment of 4 machine guns and 240 rounds of ammunition was en route to the U.S. Embassy, which he was to give to the assassin in a clandestine manner. Separately, 3 carbine rifles were being dropped off at the U.S. Embassy by a Navy contact, Bissell said. Dearborn kept the assassination in the loop through a liaison, or cutout, so as to ensure he never had direct contact with the killers. I had a different typewriter on which I typed out my messages to the opposition so that it wouldn't be traced to the embassy typewriters, Dearborn recalled, but in truth, I had told the State Department via CIA communication all about the plan. Dearborn's job was to maintain plausible deniability should anything go wrong. I knew how they were planning to do it. I knew more or less who was involved, although I was always able to say that I personally didn't know any of the assassins. I knew those who were pulling the strings. Until then, he had a facade of diplomacy to uphold. There had to be a certain set of circumstances when they could put their plan into action. For now, he was ordered away. Meanwhile, in Miami, the lethal covert action operation in which Felix Rodriguez would assassinate Fidel Castro was given the green light. It was the second week in January, 1961. Rodriguez recalls, just days before John F. Kennedy took office as president. Late one night, a handler picked up Felix Rodriguez from the safe house outside Miami, where he'd been staying. Rifle case in hand, he was driven to a small beach in the Florida Keys. The driver flashed the lights and a small boat came ashore. He recalls Rodriguez climbed into a small rubber boat that ferried him out to a much larger yacht, waiting about a half-mile out at sea. The captain was an American, Rodriguez remembers, but the crew were all Ukrainians, tough-looking SOBs who carried out Soviet bloc automatic weapons. Back at the safe house, Rodriguez was told he wouldn't have to sight the rifle when he arrived in Cuba. It had already been zeroed in. The residence army in Cuba had obtained a building in Havana, facing a location that Castro frequented at the time, and they'd managed to present the rifle, says Rodriguez. Under the cover of night, the yacht sped across the ocean to infiltrate Cuba near Varadero Beach on the north coast. We showed up at a predetermined location, recalls Rodriguez. But the rendezvous boat failed to show, and the group returned to Miami. Days later, another attempt was made. Arriving at the target area, this second time, Rodriguez recalls seeing a 100-foot-long ship, clearly far too large for a clandestine op. It looked like a ghost ship. We couldn't see anybody on board. The group aborted the mission a second time and again returned to Miami. On a third infiltration attempt, the yacht suffered hydraulic failure. Back in Miami, the vessel was met by a case officer who asked Felix Rodriguez for the rifle and ammunition. They said they'd changed their mind about the mission, Rodriguez recalls. In Washington, D.C., President Eisenhower and his staff prepared to leave the White House. The baton would now pass to the handsome young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. The day before Kennedy's inauguration, he met with President Eisenhower in the Oval Office. Partially declassified records from this meeting on January 19, 1961, indicate that the ongoing and incoming presidents discussed the more critical covert action operations being planned by the special group in Cuba, Vietnam, and Laos. The incoming president was struck by the idea of covert action, of a hidden hand power to be wielded at the sole discretion of the commander-in-chief. One of his first actions as president was to meet with the special group to learn more. Just 8 days after taking office, the CIA's Edward Lansdale briefed President Kennedy on the dire situation in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap's mobile warfare campaign was as aggressive as it was ruthless, assassinating an average of 11 civil servants every day. Vietnam is in a critical condition, and we should treat it as a combat area of the Cold War, as an area requiring emergency treatment, Lansdale told the president. Kennedy appealed directly to Congress, bringing its attention the assassination campaign, in a speech called Urgent National Needs. He warned of Soviet hidden hand operations in Vietnam and elsewhere, of the existential threat communism posed to the free world. Their aggression is more often concealed than opened. Kennedy said, they had fired no missiles, and their troops are seldom seen. They send arms, agitators, aid, technicians, and propaganda to every troubled area. But where fighting is required, it is usually done by others, by guerrillas striking at night, by assassins striking alone, assassins who have taken the lives of 4,000 civil officers in the last 12 months in Vietnam alone. Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, President Kennedy inherited complex hidden hand operations in each of these three tiny countries from his predecessor. He also inherited President Eisenhower's special group, to which he quickly added his brother, U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. It was an unusual arrangement with far-reaching consequences. As chairman of the special group, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the most senior Justice Department official in the United States, was now in charge of overseeing the CIA's covert operations, most of which the majority of Americans would consider illegal. Assassination was at the top of the list. Yeah. Part 3, 1961. We'll begin next time.